Have you seen this before? If you frequent the FXhome.com forums, you might recognize this effect from when it was first posted there. Back in the summer of 2012, Mayar created several variations of this effect and received a lot of positive feedback about them on the forums. He also shared his project file so you could see how he constructed the effect. At long last, this is a tutorial to walk you through the process and concepts he used. So first, let's look at the basic structure of the effect. Now this is the actual project file that Mayar created, and you can see that this effect starts out as a particle effect, which is using attraction and turbulence forces to keep the particles moving around in one location. Then, a grade layer is used to create a circular shape, mainly using the bulge and magnify effects. For some of you, just this breakdown might be enough to get you started, but if you would like more details, stay tuned, because that's exactly what I'm going to give you right now. So, we are going to start from scratch and rebuild this effect. First of all, we'll need to add a new particle simulator, so you can just drag that onto the editor. That'll automatically create a composite shot containing those particles. Let's drag forward a bit so that we can see some of our particles. And then we are going to open the controls and tree down to the movement controls for the particle system. Here is where we will start. Set the scale of the particles to 30%, and that'll give us a bit more space in between them. And then increase the speed to 850. We'll also increase the life a bit to 1.5 seconds. Now open the movement variation controls, and we'll add a bit of variety. Since our primary scale is set to 30%, if we set the scale variation to 10%, then that'll give us 10% variation to either side of 30. So each of our particles can vary in size between 20% and 40% of the original size. Set the speed variation to 50 to give some slight variance to the speed as well. Okay, I'll close up those movement controls. And now if you play your effect, you can see that we just have particles flying all out. And so we need to constrain them to this central area. So to do that, we're going to use forces. So add a new force by clicking this button, and we'll open it up and set the type to attraction. You can see immediately that has pulled our particles toward the middle there. And let's rename that force. We'll just call it attraction. And that way when we create our next force, we'll be able to easily distinguish between them. And if you play that effect now, you can see that we've got those particles are basically just bouncing. They move outward and then get pulled back toward the center of the effect there. So let's create a second force now by clicking this button again. We'll rename this one Turbulence. And then let's change the type to Turbulence. That's going to create more random movement in the particles, so instead of bouncing straight in and out, we'll get them flying around a bit more randomly. Okay, we'll come back and dial in the settings for these forces a bit more later. But now that we have them in place, let's adjust the appearance of our actual particles. So in the appearance controls, we can select the color we want to use. In the original, Mayar used a light blue, and so we'll do similar. Going to kind of use a pale blue, and then set the blend mode to add. That will create a brightening effect. And now we can select a texture. Now in his version, Mayar used a custom texture, which you can do if you'd like, but to keep this tutorial as simple as possible, I'm going to go with one of the built-in options. And actually the first option, the Aurora Borealis textures, works pretty well for this effect, so we'll just leave it on that. Later on, if you want to try different textures to see how it creates variety in the appearance, I encourage you to do that. But with the Aurora Borealis texture selected, uncheck the billboard option, and then enable Align to Motion, and you'll see that immediately the textures get a very different shape. Basically, the billboard option means that the texture is always facing straight toward the camera. The flat side of the texture of that image is facing toward the camera. And when we've aligned them to motion, we've basically converted each one to a little 3D plane that can rotate in all directions to line up with whatever direction the particle is traveling in. So now if we play this again, you can see we have a very different appearance to the effect. And that is the basic particle effect. So we can now move on to the grade layer to create the sphere. So from the new layer menu, let's create a new grade. You can also use Control-Alt-G to create our grade layer. And the first thing we're going to do is add a light rays effect. Here's light rays. Drag that onto our grade layer. You can see that that dramatically brightens things up and creates a cool flickering effect, but it's a bit too intense. That flickering is kind of extreme. So in the light rays controls, bring the intensity down to 0.3. So that's a much more subtle effect. And we can always adjust this later based on the final appearance we're after once the effect is kind of more finalized. So now we'll add a bulge effect to our grade layer. And in the controls for that, we'll increase the bulge property until we start to get the shape we are after. Somewhere around 6 should do for now. You might notice that the camera lines get a bit distorted as well, these green and red placement lines. That's just because our grade layer is a 2D layer above the camera and 3D effects. It won't affect the final video at all, but since we don't really need that for now, we can just go into the options and hide the floor plane to get rid of those lines. Alternatively, if you were to make this grade layer a 3D plane, it would be in the same 3D space as the floor plane, and it would not distort those lines. But back to our effect, let's now add a magnify. And we will match the radius to our bulge, which you can see has a radius of 200. So we'll start by matching that. And you can see that we have a strange appearance with these angled lines and so forth in it. That's because the default blend mode of stencil is in effect. And so let's just change that to lighten, and we get much more of the appearance we're after. Now let's increase the magnification to 4.8. And that really enhances the sphere appearance of this. And so then we'll increase the bulge as well to 0.94. And the last effect we will add is a flicker. And this is just going to bring a little bit more life to the effect. So I'll set the brightness there to 1.15. And at this point, if you play the project back, you should have a pretty good energy sphere happening. Now we do have a few stray particles that are escaping from that radius of the sphere, which could be a cool effect in itself, but that's not what we're after in this case. So we're going to rein those back in. To do that, we're going to go back to our particle system and in particular, look at the forces. In the attraction force, open the type and we'll increase the strength to 40%. There we're basically just increasing the force pulling the particles toward the center of the frame, so it's harder for them to get out here beyond the borders of our sphere. Now if you play through that, you can see we have most of those particles under control. Now in the turbulence, reduce the smoothing to 1% and bump the strength up a bit to 30%. So now you can see we still have a couple of particles that are escaping. Those will get handled as we move on to the next part of the effect, which is to reduce the speed of the entire effect. Once we reduce the speed, these particles won't have enough momentum to reach escape velocity and get away from this attraction force that exists in the center of the frame. So, in the general controls for our particle layer, we have a time scale control. At 100%, the entire effect runs at normal speed, at 100% actual speed. We're going to reduce this to slow the entire effect down. So we're going to bring this down to 15%. Incidentally, if you want the effect to already exist at the start of the timeline, you can use the time shift to handle that. Set a negative value of 5 seconds, that's -5, and that basically just starts the effect 5 seconds before the timeline begins, so that when the timeline starts, we already have the effect well in play. So it's nearly complete now, and it looks pretty good. The last thing we want to do to try and reduce some of the jerkiness and smooth things out a little bit is to fade the particles in and out. So select your particle system and open the lifetime panel. Now we could use the alpha control to fade the particles in, but instead we're going to use the scale property. So we'll scroll down to scale, and we're basically just going to start them at 0% scale so that they're so small you can't see them, and they'll gradually grow up to their full size. So we'll use this flat graph preset as our starting point. And now we'll come in about 10% from each end and add a new keyframe. We can dial that in, set the life to 10 and the scale to 100. Then do the same thing on the other end. Create a new point. I got the 90% good. We'll set the scale to 100. And now we can take the first point and just set the scale to 0. And then select the point at the very end, and again set the scale to 0. Now our particles are going to start at 0 size, grow up to full size, and then at the end they'll shrink back down until they disappear. So there's that, and if you followed along, you now have a cool energy sphere sort of effect to play with. You can adjust the appearance now by trying different textures in the appearance controls of the particle simulator. You could also change the color of the effect there. So thank you very much for watching. In the future, we plan to create a tutorial on compositing this effect into a live action scene, so please subscribe to our channel to make sure you don't miss that.